So now, let's take a close look at who suppressed ivermectin. The first big player to suppress ivermectin was the mainstream media. The New York Times led the way by declaring that the Senate hearing had promoted unproven drugs and dubious claims. AP followed with an astonishing claim that there's no evidence that ivermectin works against COVID-19, conveniently ignoring every single one of the studies that was listed in the FLCCC paper. The next group to suppress ivermectin was big tech. YouTube, which is owned by Google, censored a popular video by Dr. Chris Martenson on ivermectin. They did the same to Dr. Christy Reisinger.
To my shock and dismay, the previous video I published on December 22nd about ivermectin was taken down by YouTube.
Twitter went as far as blacklisting a European medical journal that published an article on treating COVID-19 with ivermectin. Facebook went even further and removed posts by the FLCCC about their paper. The next major group to suppress ivermectin was the NIH, America's National Institutes of Health. In April of 2020, the NIH formed the COVID-19 Treatment Guidelines Panel. This panel was incredibly influential because essentially they decided what treatment doctors in the United States could use to treat patients with COVID-19. Here are the panel's treatment recommendations from January 3rd, 2021, taken from their website. These were in place for most of 2020. Take a close look at the recommendations for people who are COVID positive but not yet in the hospital, or in the hospital but not yet requiring oxygen supplementation. They say that a doctor can apply for an EUA, or Emergency Use Authorization, for a monoclonal antibody, a very troublesome process, but they recommend no other treatments. This approach to treating early COVID has been described as therapeutic nihilism by Dr. Paul Marik. Leaving aside ivermectin for the moment, this is truly shocking, especially given what we know about the efficacy of things like vitamin D in preventing COVID from progressing to more severe stages. And preventing that progression is paramount because there's a point of no return for many patients with COVID. Once they cross it and require intubation, they often cannot be saved. So just think about this policy for a second. The NIH COVID-19 Treatment Panel is saying, do not treat your patients until they are so sick that they need to be put on supplemental oxygen. They only make a definitive drug recommendation for patients who have deteriorated to the point where they will not survive without supplemental oxygen. And once they are that sick, what treatment do they recommend? They recommend a drug called remdesivir. It's almost as if the treatment guidelines are designed to get the patients to the point where they can be treated with remdesivir. Let's take a closer look at remdesivir. Most people first heard of remdesivir when Dr. Anthony Fauci made the unusual move of announcing it at a White House press conference in April 2020. Fauci is the head of the NIAID, the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is a department of the NIH. Here's Dr. Fauci speaking about remdesivir at the White House. Listen carefully to what he says about the endpoint of the study he's referring to.
The data shows that remdesivir has a clear-cut, significant positive effect in diminishing the time to recovery.
Note that he doesn't say anything about mortality. He talks about diminishing the time to recovery. It's essential to note that Dr. Fauci's NIAID actually paid for this study he's referring to. So basically, Dr. Fauci can hardly be called an impartial judge of that study. And just as importantly, Dr. Fauci would have been well aware of the developments with the study as it was performed. He would have been well aware of the fact that midway through the trial, the primary endpoint was changed from mortality to time to recovery. And this was obviously because the researchers were seeing that remdesivir had no significant impact on mortality. Changing endpoints midway through a study is highly unusual, and many scientific commentators raised concerns about this. And yet Dr. Fauci, knowing that remdesivir did nothing to reduce mortality in COVID-19, pressed on, touting the drug as a remarkable advance in the treatment of COVID.
But we think it's really opening the door to the fact that we now have the capability of treating, and I can guarantee you, as more people, more companies, more investigators get involved, it's going to get better and better.
Not very long after Anthony Fauci made that statement, the World Health Organization recommended against the use of remdesivir. Based on much larger studies, they said there is no evidence that remdesivir improves survival or any other metric in COVID-19. Despite that, the NIH treatment panel continued to recommend remdesivir and continues to do so today. Now all of this begs the question, why would the NIH and Dr. Fauci continue to recommend a drug that has repeatedly been shown to have no effect on improving COVID-19 survival, and which costs over $3,100 per course, unlike ivermectin, which is nearly free? In order to answer that question, we have to look at who makes remdesivir and how they're related to the people who decide what drugs can be used to treat COVID-19. Remdesivir is made by Gilead Sciences, a pharmaceutical company located in Foster City, California. Gilead is an interesting company. From 1997 to 2001, the chairman of Gilead Sciences was Donald Rumsfeld, one of the architects of the invasion of Iraq. During the same period, one of the board members of Gilead was George Shultz, a longtime Bush family ally who was instrumental in convincing George W. Bush to run for President of the United States. In order to understand why the NIH treatment panel is so pro-remdesivir, it's essential to understand the financial ties between Gilead Sciences and members of that treatment panel. If you look at the treatment panel's financial disclosures, you will see that no fewer than 7 members disclose financial support from Gilead Sciences. Interestingly, the 3 co-chairs who select the other members of the panel do not disclose support from Gilead. However, 2 of the chairs, Roy Gulick and Henry Masor, both receive financial support from Gilead. Even more interestingly, the 3rd co-chair, Clifford Lane, was actually one of the authors of the NIAID study on remdesivir. But you won't see his name in the list of the article's authors. You have to look in the financial disclosure form that accompanied that article. It's also worth noting that 7 out of 12 of his co-authors on that study disclosed funding from Gilead Sciences. The significance of this cannot be overstated. 2 of the 3 chairs of the NIH COVID-19 treatment panel, the people who put the panel together, received financial support from Gilead Sciences, while the other was intimately involved in the study that attempted and failed to prove that remdesivir was an effective treatment for COVID-19. Given these professional and financial ties, is there any way we could reasonably expect them to impartially judge the best treatments for COVID-19, or choose panel members who might advocate for repurposing cheap, off-patent drugs that would completely undercut the market for one of the main products of a company with which they enjoy close financial and professional ties? It's not necessary for any of them to have said, let's not promote cheap drugs and promote remdesivir instead. Financial and research interests had already corrupted their decision-making processes and biases. But we should be clear. There are sins of omission and sins of commission. And there's no way that the members of the panel, at least some of them, were unaware of the research concerning ivermectin, and yet no one chose to bring that to the fore in their meetings. Rather than recommend ivermectin, or at least recommend more studies into ivermectin, they chose to continue to push the drug remdesivir, which they knew had no discernible effect on COVID-19 survival. This is professional negligence of the worst sort, and given the disproportionate influence that America's medical agencies have on many other countries' medical agencies, it's very likely that their negligence resulted in hundreds of thousands or even millions of deaths around the world. And let us be completely clear about why they chose to suppress ivermectin and push a drug that they knew didn't work. They did it so that one pharmaceutical company with deep political connections, huge media support, and big tech backing could make obscene profits for themselves and their shareholders. Now let's imagine, just as a thought exercise, what if the NIH and Dr. Anthony Fauci had been doing their jobs? What if, sometime in the summer of 2020, they had authorized doctors across the country to use ivermectin at their discretion? It's actually not that hard to figure out what would have happened, because there is a place, with a population almost the size of the United States, where that's exactly what the health authorities did. The state of Uttar Pradesh in India has a population about 70% the size of the United States. In August of 2020, the Uttar Pradesh state government authorized the use of ivermectin as a prophylaxis and treatment for COVID-19. It was given to those who tested positive for COVID, as well as their primary contacts and healthcare workers. Let's look at the stats for COVID-19 mortality in Uttar Pradesh. There was a peak of mortality in the summer, but deaths dropped very quickly after that. As we get into January of 2021, we see that deaths are averaging fewer than 10 a day. And on January 19th, in a state with 230 million people, exactly no one died from COVID-19. While in the United States, a country with a much more expensive medical system, we're averaging over 3,000 deaths per day. We know who the villains are in this story. But who are the victims? If you've lost a friend or a family member to COVID-19, you are a victim. If your children's education or socialization has been disrupted by COVID-19, you are a victim. If you've lost your job or your business because of COVID-19, you are a victim. If you are suffering from long COVID and you don't know when or if you will get better, you are a victim. If you're elderly and you are aware that time is limited, and yet you cannot meet with your children or grandchildren, you are a victim. It is now clear that big tech and the mainstream media worked with the NIH to suppress knowledge of a drug that could have ended the pandemic last summer. This is not mere professional negligence. This is a crime.